And she said, well, what happened was that during the lunchtime, I was talking about the games I play, the sports I'm in. And I like playing chess, I like playing football. And some of my friends were laughing and they said, well, okay, give us an example. And she said, well, I wear Messi jersey when I play football, or I really am very much interested in watching the games of cricket or by Magnus. And they were laughing because they said, well, you can see that your examples are all boys, isn't it? So why are you spending more time pursuing something that you won't be able to carry forward? And that's where she paused. And in that moment, when I realized something very unsettling, I didn't have a simple answer. Not that because I don't understand the theory, or I don't teach gender, or I don't understand communication, power, because that's part of my daily life, and that's what I do in the classroom. But because her questions expose the truth that my generation has normalized. What do I say to her? Do I normalize that feeling? Do I just say, carry on as normal, it doesn't work, it doesn't matter, it's up to you what you do, and just kind of forget it and don't question it. Because we grew up learning that equality was about fighting for a place at the table, right? But our generation is actually asking a very different question. And her question is very much about, why is that table built that way in the first place? And that is, to me, is both a challenge and a hope of our time. Because it made me wonder, what have I learned, or perhaps internalized, that made it harder for me to answer her questions without passing on my generation's anxieties. Because as I grew up, I have influences. When I'm talking to you, it's not just me. It's all the external influences that I had when I was in school, when I was in college, and university, and also the family I had, the friends I had. So all of that has brought me to what I am today. And therefore, I think there is always a generational anxiety built into that conversation when we're talking about gender. So the question really I started asking is that, why do we even, with all our education and progress, still struggle to imagine a truly equal and compassionate future, one that is not defined by binaries or outdated norms, and that reminded me that resilience for the next generation isn't about preparing them to survive the world we have made. It is more about preparing us to unlearn the limits we have accepted, so that we can reimagine or help them to reimagine the world from their context. And I use this as a case study because I think that there is a lot going on in the younger generation that perhaps for my generation we can't understand, because the exposure is huge and there are a lot of external influences that's making them think differently every day. That brings me to think about and taking that as a starting point. I started thinking, right, okay, so when I deliver this presentation to you, I'm going to actually focus on, I can't actually include everything, but what I can do is I can structure it in a way that we as academics, we teach, we do research, so there is a power in that research and there's a power in teaching. So I start from that context to then think about the external influences. Of course, I can't include all the external influences, so I'm going to focus on two specific ones, which is the media and technology. So that brings me to move on to my next slide, which is now thinking about education as a catalyst for change. If we see education as a catalyst for change, it doesn't matter what we say really. I mean, to some extent it does, because you're kind of grounding them theoretically in the classroom around gender studies, educating them about the influences that gender studies have from a post-colonial perspective. But because of my background in anthropology, I am always driven by thinking, how can education be a catalyst for change, and what we need to do in the classroom in order to bring that to life. And in my role, of course, I have those kind of conversations every day to think about the representation of staff, to think about the representation of students, but also about closing the gap. So how can I provide that platform and reduce the gap that exists in our society? So to me, right, it is fundamental that we actually, yes, we teach them about gender, but we also teach them or give them a more powerful tool of questioning and questioning where necessary, because we are living in an age where we are bounded by unprecedented connectivity. Globalization is good in many senses, it's bad in many other senses, but globalization and digital communication have collapsed the geographical boundaries. So it is no more the case that you sit in India and you don't know what's happening in Germany, right? So you go onto the online platform, you understand the whole world because you are seeing that through the lens. But also equally, it is really important when we're talking about gender to be reflective. Because the lens that's being applied to say the stories or share the stories online has got cultural influences, it has got system influences, and it is very powerful spaces though, because it kind of creates those kind of values, identities, and aspirations. And as academics, I think that in order to make education, as Catherine said, we need to embrace that kind of consciousness in the teaching. And what best other than to bring theory in it? And I said, fortunately or unfortunately, as you may see it, due to time constraint, it's nearly impossible to actually talk about everything. So for the purpose of the talk, I start with theory because I want to address this concept of freedom when we talk about gender in the classroom and beyond. Because education is not just the transmission of knowledge, it is a vehicle for transformation. And when I say that it's not just the transmission of knowledge, what we mean is that I'm not talking about change here. Because whenever you're talking about change means that you're already, you're moving on, yes, but you're still carrying on the burden of the past. But when we're talking about transformation, we're talking about something completely new, a new lens being applied to think. And I think classroom gives us that freedom to think, to make the learners critically engage with the world and how to change it. And that also starts with us and how we perform. So I think as we are teaching in the classroom, it's a form of performance and a very powerful performance that can have long-lasting impact. And you can see that if you're connecting with your students later on in their life, they get connected on LinkedIn and all of that, and they come back saying, "Oh, Miss, do you actually still do that? Do you actually still bring sweets in the class? Do you actually come and see whether we are doing the work?" And and it kind of says to you a lot because you do leave an impact in a smaller scale, right? Because oftentimes when we're talking about education in the classroom, we talk about the theoretical understanding of a subject, right? But actually how we are bringing that theory into practice is something quite crucial because then as we do, normally in our life, we pass the baton on. So we start thinking and we start saying, oh, it's the government level, it's policy for our chief. But I think that's where the problem starts, because if you can't see something or if you can't actually transform in a micro level, you can't potentially have an influence in the macro level. And that's where I think that it is really important as activists, we become the active agents for change when the discussion happens around gender justice. Because I think, as academics, but also as as a citizen of a country, we always think that we understand certain norms, we understand how things work, but we forget that there are some deep meaning attached to certain ways that we practice. I think the concept of gender justice should be integrated in civic literacy. And I think literacy is one of the things also I would bring in this context, whether it's a technological change that we're talking about, or if we are talking about gender, it all falls into that category of literacy. And what we mean by literacy is deep learning, not surface learning, and there will always remain a difference between surface learners and deep learners. The more you deep learn a subject, the more you can query it. And I think, that is what we need to do as academics. We need to think, okay, well, yes, so I'm teaching gender, but how can I actually empower others to talk about gender and query gender? So one of the ways that we have done that in the university, I would say, is by looking at the representation of our female academics in the leadership roles. So we have said, well, we need to think about how we can have roles that's being rolled out on, it's a rotational role where people come in and gain some experience. And I think that's how you start closing or addressing the gap that exists. But this also means that teaching students, you're not only kind of asking them to think about gender and how they interact with gender studies, but you're also asking them to question the existing narratives that's shaping their gender and identity, especially amplified by technology and media. And I think one of the things that I would also like to share is that how do we do it? One is, of course, we have tried doing that by diversifying the curriculum, because there is a lot of influence from the West, and one of the things we also do is decolonizing the curriculum, which means that you have to think about proper representation, but at the same time you are bringing in voices from the rest of the world, and it has really worked wonderful. Because some of our students now are working in Costa Rica, say for example, they've gone on projects, doing projects in Kenya. And I think that gave them that exposure, and that's like really, really important, I think, how you carry that voice outside. And as we're discussing around education, I believe that two of the things that we can't talk about, because those are the powerful forces that's operating currently shaping our social context, our social landscape, I would say, is one, the global connectivity, where cultural boundaries are blurring through digital exchange, and also the artificial intelligence. Now here I'm not talking about artificial general intelligence, because there is a stark difference between the two, right? We're not there yet. We're not talking about AGIs, because of course that requires quantum computers. And as general people, we don't have access to quantum computers yet, so we don't need to worry about whether they are going to replace us completely. But what we have to think about is that the bias that the artificial intelligence and that one brings in. There is some level of social anxiety embedded into it, and I think that's the same anxiety that we had when computers came in our houses, because of course, some of our elderly people around us would say, well, don't do too much work on the computers, because that's going to make your handwriting poor. And here we are, we're actually day in and day out typing on computers without any anxiety. But it took us 20 years. So technology changes every 20, 25 years, but it's about how we shift our focus and how we build that. So I think that's also one of the things that's kind of changing. But the reason artificial intelligence can be a challenge in the gender context is because that it's fed by a large language model, which means that although we're talking about artificial intelligence and machine intelligence, but all the data that's been fed into that is by human inputs. And as human beings, we have got bias. And of course, when we are feeding the systems with data, there will be bias. So I think using the artificial intelligence to your advantage, to talk about gender equity and identify those problems is also very, very important. And I think the best way to do that, really, which is what for us, is to bring the data inside the classroom, to kind of showcase actually what is happening in the outside world, because numbers speaks a lot, if you're looking into the gaps and you're trying to see, okay, how far are we, and what are the things that we need to be mindful about when we are talking about gender gap. So this one that we are seeing now on the screen is the Global Gender Gap Index, and this is a framework for capturing the magnitude and scope of gender-based disparities, and also tracking the progress between the different countries to see, how they are progressing. And there are different levels at which it's being designed, as you see on the screen. One is the health and survival gender gap, then there is the education and attainment gap. World-wise, we are not doing that bad in those two areas. But as soon as you start looking into the economic participation and opportunities, you see the stark gap there. It's started, at the 60%. And political empowerment is another one. And that's why you see the presidents and all the politicians, mostly men in those roles. And I think this is again something that we need to think about, that by having this conversation in the classroom, how are we empowering the next generation to think beyond and to think and to stretch their capacity. So the global gender gap index benchmark, it benchmarks the national gender gaps on economic, political, education, and health risk criteria, and you see that Iceland has done really well. So all of the Scandinavian countries are actually performing really well because they have taken active initiatives to embed it within their, it's called systems thinking. So what they have done is they have looked at it in different levels of the society and tried to minimize that gap. Compared to Iceland, if you look into UK, we're standing at 0.84, and although it looks like 9 to 10% gap, but it is a huge gap, right? And then you move on from there to your right, and you see that you have got the middle there, where India, Sri Lanka, where, and it's standing out and probably in 64, 65, that area. And then you go further down, which is at the far end of that is Sudan, Pakistan, which is more around 57, 50. So from 57 to 91, from 93, it's a huge gap really. So gender equality remains one of the most persistent global challenge, and it's been recoded into the algorithms. And I think that's where the problem is, because our global systems are being limited at the moment, where it involves that kind of injustice. And I think that's what we need to challenge and activate. The World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap report that came out in 2024, it kind of warns that if we are progressing at this current rate, it will take us more than a century, 120 years, to close this gender gap worldwide. So there is a lot of fearful content out there around gender gap and things that we haven't done yet. But I think as academics, we shouldn't fear that, because all we have got is really, I think, the fear of speaking out about gender and all of that. So I think rather than viewing this as a crisis, I would personally frame this as an opportunity. An opportunity to do something that we have not done before, an opportunity to reimagine with the new generation and learn from them. But in doing so, we have to unlearn a lot as well. But I guess that the conversation around the gender gap, and driven by data, can help us to then think about deep thinking about equality and equity. Everyone is talking about equality at all levels, and that's because they have got awareness. But there is a difference between awareness and understanding, right? So being aware of something, you can make a change happen, it can enable you to change, but understanding it can make you navigate through the uncomfortable sense that you have got within. So it can help you to transform yourself. It can help you to question your own belief, and I think that's really important. Because if you see as equality and equity, you always say, well, and we talk about this a lot, that everybody has got the opportunity to actually go in and do what they want to do, okay? But how much do we actually put an effort in thinking, right, okay, so I've opened the classroom, there are students coming here and I'm teaching them, fine, but all of their lives are not the same. They have navigated with different life situations. They've got different influences, right? And they have also navigated through different structural barriers or systematic barriers as well. So how is it possible that somebody who has been more privileged, damn down the privilege, how can we actually level that up? So that was the conversation that we were having maybe 20, 30 years back. Now the question is that, okay, you have opened the room and I need to respond to, and I think that's the new thing that we are experiencing. That's the shift that you were talking about. I think that's where basically all the journey that we're talking about equity starts as well, because suddenly you're thinking, okay, I have to move out of my comfort zone. I'm not I'm not using the same language that I used to use 20 years back. Okay? I am teaching the learners to question, go into and work for an employer and then question them that, well, why is it that a male counterpart is having more payment than mine? What is it? What are you looking at? Is it my capacity, capability, or is it my gender? And I think that kind of conversation never happened before, because we kind of had to settling back into that understanding that, well, I'm a female, well, at least they have given me a job, I'm performing. And we were happy about that. But I think the next generation is saying, well, you're opening the door, but, are you thinking about my capacity and capability rather than my gender? And I think that's the shift. That systematic shift also requires a very different approach within the classroom, and to depolarize that debate, and have a shared vision. And I think that's really, really important. So if I, now that we've talked about equality and equity, I think the next question is that, okay, why do we do it? What's the purpose, And the purpose is really to empower the voices, because the more you do that, once the learners understand why equity matters, they can actually identify and challenge the inequalities in real context, from the schools to workplaces. And this is not a conversation to have just in colleges. I think gender is becoming so important in our lives these days, and the conversations around it, I think, should start in primary schools, because by that time they're already exposed to the digital content, right? So either they're not talking to you, or they will be hiding things from you, or they will be free to talk, and you are experiencing a whole new conversation around gender. It's for you to decide, which way you want to go for. But once they have got this empowered voice, remember that they will be able to advocate for more inclusive hiring, better representation of women, and also LGBTQ plus voices in leadership. Also, that's the conversation that's feeding this narrative. It's a global conversation we're having. I went to a conference the other day, and we were talking about, some students were asking, okay, why do I go to a university? And what is learning? Also, with that challenge we're going to experience. So the question is that, are we taking understanding the situation and thinking about empowering those voices, giving them the tools to navigate in the society, rather than it has really evolved in our present look like from a gender studies context. And it's like more critical awareness, the emotional intelligence as well. So somebody says to you, oh, you're fat, you go and question, okay, is it your problem that I'm fat, or is it the question that my fatness is actually having an impact on my health? If it is the second one, I'm happy with that. If it is the first one, I'm going to question you, where did that narrative emerge from? So I think that kind of progress is what we're looking at, And there's a landmark study actually at MIT that found that the groups with higher female and other representation or more equitable participation overall demonstrated significantly higher problem-solving capacity, and that was not because of the IQ, but it was because of the social sensitivity, because it was collective effort, and it was not a biased effort, And I think that collaborative problem-solving skills is what we are looking for going in the future as well. And what that means is that in the curriculum, you can talk about gender-inclusive content, you can also think about, right, okay, there's a classroom space, but there is also a role modeling and mentoring that we can provide to our students, so as to enable them to take that first step, right? But at the same time, I think the cross-cultural and so that conversation can be immensely powerful. So that brings me nicely thinking about, now that we have talked about education and our role, I think now it brings me to think about, right, okay, what should education involve? What are the external influences we have that we should talk about in the classroom, but also we should be conscious about and interacting with these external factors or external motivators in some ways. Because traditional gender norms, whether about who leads, who cares, who belongs, it continues to shape the aspirations from very early childhood. The media, say for example, both traditional and digital, they remain double-edged swords because on one hand you will see that it perpetuates stereotype. I don't know if this happens in India now, but here, of course, because I go to different spaces with my daughter as well, and I see that the color split, so if you're a girl, you're in pink. If you're a boy, you're in blue, And I was talking to one of my friends the other day, and she was saying to me, "Oh, I'm really worried." I said, "What's worrying you?" And her daughter is like really little, so she is like 4 years old now. And she was saying, "Oh, I'm very, very worried about she watching the Paw Patrol." Paw Patrol is a cartoon series. And it has got a lot of boy characters, but there is a girl character as well. But it's more about jumping, navigating cars, and this and that. So I said, "What's worrying you?" No, usually Paw Patrol is something that the boys watch, and my girl has started watching that. So I said, "My girl has watched that as well. So what's wrong in that?" And I think those are the kind of conversations that we need to bring in early on, without shying off from that conversation. But on the other hand, we also see a very constructive effect from the media. If you look into the always sanitary napkin advert and the Like a Girl campaign, if you go into that, you'll see, or the UN campaign, UN Woman campaign, they launched the He for She campaign. You see Dove, who has been trying from 2013 onwards to talk and redefine beauty and how we see beauty. You can also see the Nike and the Adidas campaigns, which has brought forward the gender empowerment kind of content, where they are talking about gender equity and how you actually vouch for it in your workplace while you're studying, look for the changes in your textbooks and all of that. So I think there is also this educational, powerful storytelling going on in the media. But the problem is that, there are a lot of red crawlers who crawls through the web as you're navigating through your different social media platforms. And it can pick up your behavior and then kind of serve you with the content. And that content may not have, or may be carrying very traditional, outdated gender norms, and your child is suddenly exposed to that. So I guess as academics, we need to be very, very mindful of how we navigate with the content, what we are exposing ourselves to, but also others to. Because gender norms are socially constructed hierarchies, and challenging them requires more than awareness, deep thinking, as I said, and it also requires agency. And if you're not providing that agency with your students, I'm not making a change. And if I'm not making a change in the micro level, I can't expect it to be seen in the macro level. And media literacy again, so this is another one, previously I was talking about civic literacy. So this is where the media literacy comes in as well. So, and the critical pedagogy. And how you deconstruct the narratives, or how do you produce the counter narratives to rewrite them in a more kind of inclusive way. Now, inclusivity doesn't mean that you bring in different characters and put it together in a slide, and many people do that as a tick box exercise. And that's a surface level, more kind of demonstrating, that we are for it, but actually not practicing in life. So I think digital citizenship requires you to be much more mindful and to expose kind of biases in representation, authenticity as well. If your voice is not authentic. And I think this is what nicely brings me into this critical thinking and emotional thinking, because as human beings we are wired to be emotionally driven most of the time. So when you are going into watching a movie, or if you're watching something on Netflix or content on YouTube, say for example, your emotional brain has been consciously activated, right? But if you don't actually do the same thing with your critical thinking at the same time, which is the neocortex part of your brain, and you're not engaging with that, what happens is that you get driven by your conscious thinking more emotionally, and then all of that sinks into your unconscious beliefs. And I think that's where the challenge begins. And I've given you a content as well. This has nothing to do with gender, but this is a very good, very interesting sort of content by the way, I watch a lot of Simon Sinek and also Mel Robbins. They talk a lot about vision, but also values. They talk from a business perspective, but it makes a lot of sense to me as an academic. And I think that what we're trying to think here is that there are fundamentally three questions that should guide us when we're looking at media as well. We start with the why, then we say what we are watching, or how it's making a difference, and then we say what we are watching actually, what impact is happening or having in our daily lives. So I think the why question is really important. Why we are watching, why is something we say in a movie, and how it's being portrayed. And you see that day in and day out. We have moved on, we have had lots of conversations around gender equality, but you still see the movies like we say, like Animal surfacing up, because media remains one of those most powerful cultural educators, and it reflects and constructs the social norms as well, especially if you look through the popular culture lens. And if you look into that, when you're sitting here and watching it, you're really a consumer, and sometimes we forget, sometimes I don't feel very, I don't enjoy many of the movies sometimes, because I keep on engaging with that critical questioning. But I think it's in a good way, because I think it gives me the food for thought for taking into my classroom. But at the same time, it helps me to revisit my subconscious beliefs and helps me to alter that and counter my own narrative, because the product that I am today, as I said, it came a lot of environmental influences, not that I'm always right. And I think if you take Bollywood, for instance, for decades it has shaped how millions across South Asia imagine love or beauty or masculinity or power, from hyper-masculine hero archetype, they're the saviors coming in, and they're going to actually, they're the powerful ones who actually tell you what to do. And then you've got this idealized sacrificial mother, and I think that has driven our narratives in societies quite a long time, because when I grew up, I always saw that, well, when I'm coming back from school, it's my mother who's going to be put the food on the table, right? I never expected the same from my father, because I was never told that it's parental thing that matters, but it's mothers, and they need to sacrifice, and they need to be actually giving more than the other counterpart, and that's a question that we are happening. That's happening in the UK as well at the moment. In the university, we're talking about parental leave, because that's another bias, again, gender bias, that why a father is also becoming a parent, so they should also be given parental leave, because it's a transformation happening in their life as well. So I think those kind of questions need to be asked, but at the same time you need to be thinking about what's being shown to you and how you can create that. The other thing is also the conversations around the queerness on screen. While India has made progress, notably with the 2018 decriminalization of Section 377, and also the 2023 Supreme Court hearing on the same-sex marriage, the struggle for equality, equity in that realm continues, because the media narrative surrounding the LGBTQ identifies in India are often very polarized, and the representation is very tokenistic, or it is sensationalized to an extent where it becomes a different kind of painted character. But on the other hand, we have also seen the rise of digital platforms where it has provided that space for resistance, where creators or activists or educators have come forward to share their stories and build communities, a safe space for them to belong, breathe in, and all of that. So as educational spaces where we belong, we must reflect this complexity, because true resilience, I think, only comes if you give students a sense of belonging and authenticity. It doesn't help if you actually fast forward some of the communications around gender because you are not comfortable with it. So, because there will be someone sitting in your classroom who doesn't recognize your voice, who doesn't recognize what you're saying. So I think that representation, again, is something that we should talk about. Integrating that LGBTQ perspective into the curriculum is really, really important. Moving on to the next one, of course, is that, I'm saying change is not happening, but it's not happening to that extent, because every time you have been talking about an empowering narrative, there are 10 more which reinforces the gender hierarchies or to erase the queer identities that was created by others. So it's like, this is where the education and the critical media literacy becomes again very essential, to deconstruct these cultural messages and to build resilience against the internalized bias that we all have to some extent. So we have to make that conscious effect. That brings me nicely on to my very last one, which is around the AI-generated content. And I covered a little bit at the very beginning to say that it's a large language model, so nothing is coming from outside. It cannot do something original because all the data has been fed to it. So it will only say what already exists. It can't do anything novel or innovative, right? And if you want the machine to do and function at that level, we're talking about AGI, and we are not there yet. But I think that's where the AI systems, because they learn from existing data, it reflects social biases. And so when AI generates a content, it can amplify the stereotypes unless you are, unless you're carefully designed or prompting carefully, or the AI system that you're operating with is ethically governed. So I think those are the kind of questions that we are looking at when we're looking at artificial intelligence. In the context of India, this becomes even more complex because the algorithms trained on global data sets may ignore local cultural nuances, and it can replicate the Western and more kind of patriarchal worldviews. So when we are bringing in or navigating through AI platforms, I think that's one of the things that we should be also mindful of. And as educators, I think we can't say no to AI. But again, this is where it comes to talk about the artificial intelligence literacy. Okay, so all of the literacy bits should have some form of gender embedded in it, and we train that from within the classroom. If I and it's kind of experimenting with the platform, the AI platform, and as you can see possibly from the screen, I've identified in some of the professions. I gave a prompt to the AI to say that I want some images of a scientist. It didn't do that bad. If you look at the first four on the top left, and it looked more or less okay. There is a representation. As I moved on from the scientist to an engineer, you see all men, right? There is some sketch here about a robot. Looks like a female, but it's also looked at as if it's a creation by the man, right? If I go into the further down, I get prompts about, okay, can you give me some images of features? And this is where you see all female, no male represented there at all, right? And then I said doctors, and this is what I got. So again, for scientists and doctors, I think there was still a little bit of a balance, but you can see how stereotypes can actually be amplified by AI-generated content, and you can play yourself as well to see the bias and identify that and bring that in the lessons. So finally, there are questions to be raised around ethics, training data, and also representational politics. So a report by UNESCO actually suggests that there is about 80% of the AI-generated images of the CEOs are depicted white men. Again, another kind of bias, while women were more overrepresented in nursing and teaching. I didn't try with the nursing, but I can certainly see, yes, it was in teaching roles. So even voice assistants are trained in a way, which is more sort of service-oriented, and it's more kind of female voices than male voices. And that's the kind of gender bias that we're looking at when we're navigating through artificial intelligence. So finally, thinking about, if we are talking about a resilient future, what is the framework for action? So I think that critical pedagogy is really important, especially in every bit of text. Also understanding how do we construct meaning, and what are we expecting our students to do, that will determine what they learned around gender. The digital literacy was also plays an important role. It's also about that compassionate leadership and systems thinking. So not identifying yourself as an individual, but you identify yourself as an individual navigating through the external forces that you have to day in and day out. And also global citizenship and cultural dialogue. So the more we do this, it's easy to say that this is what we need to do, but when we are operationalizing that in the university here, I think the difficulty is, one, to find an intent, two, that there is always this like, why do we need to learn this, why do we need to do this? So, is there a real value? We have been always kind of quoting from the text to talk about things, what are the practical implications, how does that matter? Now, anybody who is studying, not everyone is going to go into a teaching profession, but there are many who go out and work in outside world. So I think it's really important that you give them the tools to survive, and not to survive, but to thrive in an external context. So I summarized by this book, which I found really, really influential. I liked reading it. It draws in from post-colonial theory. It also reflects on historical insights. But what it really does is it positions feminism in the context of Africa. And I think that's really, really important. So the cultural consciousness about feminism and how we are navigating through those challenges of our identity, patriarchy, our imagination, our conditions, our thoughts, and what we are saying. And those kind of things are like really, really important. So, one of the things she says in the book is that feminism is a collective effort to transform. It's not about the woman to do it, but you have to have an equal buy-in from everyone within society, and you need to kind of embed that into actions. So every voice, every identity, and every team has the power to be heard, and I think that's what we do. So I bring back you all to that education that I started with, because I think hope is not naive, hope is more strategic. So to build a resilient future, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of people, and it takes a lot of conscious engagement. And I hope that I have tried to give you some of the thought-provoking conversation that you might have following this presentation. Thank you very much for having me. By the way, the last one is also AI generated, and it's like very ethnic. So this is my references. I missed some of that. I've added this, so I can send a revised text as well. But this was also AI generated, and if you say that, is it biased? I don't know, but people might debate that there are colors that shouldn't have been used, or it's not well blended. But I'm open to your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was indeed an enriching session. The floor is now open for interaction. If anyone has any question or observation, you can definitely put it.
The sun is out.
I don't think there is any question, so thank you once again, ma'am. It was a very enriching session for all of us. Thank you very much. We now move to technical session. We now move to technical session 2 to be chaired by Dr. Gyanendra Tripathi, Vice Principal and Controller of Examinations, GS College of Commerce and Economics, Autonomous, Jabalpur. We extend a warm welcome and deep appreciation to you, sir, for joining us. And we have 6 paper presenters in this session, and the presenters are Pradeep Tamam, Anupama Pradhan, Ravi Bhargav, Ruksha Chakraborty, Mukhtar Hussain and Professor Ujjwal Kumar Hazard, and the last speaker for the day is Deepak Burman. So I hand over the floor to Dr. Gyanendra Tripathi, sir. Thank you.
Oh, ma'am, audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Thank you so much for giving a privilege to be to join this international conference. Great thanks to Dr. Subrata Devnath, the principal of Siliguri Mahila Mahavidyalaya, then Dr. Daya Bhattacharya, head Additional Department of Women's Studies, University of North Bengal. As a guest honor, Sri Piyush Kanti Ghosh, President, Governing Body, Siliguri. Conveners, we have Dr. Sharmila Lahiri Mehta, Associate Professor, Department of Agriculture, Siliguri. Dr. Sumitra Naha, Associate Professor, Department of Economics, Siliguri. And finally, Dr. Nitika Mani Datta, Assistant Professor, Department of Women's Studies. So it's a great pleasure for me to be among you all. And I've been listening the previous session, the technical session I was there. Seeing this, there's a short of time because it was scheduled to 3:15 and now it's almost 4 o'clock. And we are running short with the timing, so I will request, I'll be calling each and every presenters or the speakers and will request them to wind up by 5 to 7 minutes so that we can wind up in time and your delivery function may take place in time. First of all, as per the speakers, we have Parthiv Aman. He is there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So I request you to give you an idea, the concept, an idea, methodology, then your conclusions and suggestions of the paper so that we can get it and give a time to everyone. And I feel you'll be talking about the reframing the AI in healthcare. So please continue with your paper. Yes, Mr. Kamal.
Sir, I have shared my screen, sir. Sir, is the slide visible, sir? So is it visible?
No, it's not visible here.
So is it visible now?
Yes, you can start. Mr. Kumar, you can start with this.
So is it visible now, sir?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, sir. So, I hope it is visible. So, good evening, respected chairperson, sir, members of the organizing committee, my dear colleagues and friends. Since there is paucity of time, I'd like to just give a brief of what outline has already been said by the chairperson. Today my presentation is on healthcare, but through the lens of AI. So the title of my presentation is Algorithmic Care, Globalizing Gender Healthcare Norms through AI in the Global South. So as we can understand that AI has undeniably, been one of the most, it's one of the paradigm shift across healthcare from diagnostic to patient interaction. So it has reshaped the power structures and influences ethics, authority, and values in health. So here I have been taking the help of two theoretical standpoints. One is the Irving Jola's theory of medicalization and Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics. So, as we understand how Irving Zola's concept of medicalization has traditionally, from the point of view of what it was conceptualized traditionally, we understand this as how societal problems in terms of healthcare becomes more and more of, medical in the sense, and then how it is continuously monitored and driven by this, in the present context, how AI, powered by its algorithms, have transformed personal routines into targets for health intervention. So as you can see in the slide, AI's expansion leads to hyper-personalized, often standardized surveillance of human bodies. So, as we look into and drill into South Asian literature, there are some case studies. If we see and try to look at the existing case studies and the literature, we find that the kind of AI's influence and its intervention in healthcare promises it offers to set up is to provide significant potential capacities for healthcare, but alongside we see that it faces considerable gender and cultural hurdles all across South Asian context due to its data bias, due to its cultural insensitivity, and due to its access disparity. So there are certain ethical standards, ethical concerns that raises when we integrate AI in terms of women's health. When it comes to a woman's health, there are certain privacy risks, there is stigmatization from this diagnosis or data misuse, there is overdiagnosis due to algorithmic basis because bias, as has been already said eloquently by Dr. Lahiri, how these large databases are actually coordinatively fed in by humans itself, and that itself has led, or that itself will lead to the creation of bias, particularly in terms of women's health. So there is lack of consent, particularly areas which are underrepresented, or which are in very geographically, which are not situated in terms of its relationship with the center, and then the predictive algorithms usually have over time ignored these local realities. So I'm not going into the rural realities of how healthcare penetrating through the low and middle income countries in these geographically remote areas have actually negated these rural areas when it comes to the overall health concerns that we are looking at, particularly for women when we look through the lens of artificial intelligence. So next, I'll be talking about the next conceptual framework which I have taken from Foucault's concept of biopolitics. So Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics, which he has outlined, as we understand, is how biopolitics helps us understand power and how power itself takes over life, and then how this particular power relations actually manages population through health policies, through health management and establishment of institutions. But as we look into the introduction of AI and the new generation of AI and the algorithmic revolutions, this has really enabled AI to, make certain time surveillances, to continue data collections, and particularly when we look at humans, this translates into gender control. For instance, in like context like concern with demographic decline. And in terms of when we look at during the times of COVID, particularly in India, this contract tracing apps like Arogya Setu, where women's data was controlled by male members of the family, and because of this digital divide, not only they were constrained in using this app, but 33% of the female, ownership in rural areas were lacking the use of smartphones, did not have control over their smartphone. So these are some of the conceptual ideas of how AI integration into women's health can actually bring about outcomes when it comes to reproductive choices, health autonomy, and social mobility. So my next slide I is just skipping this because I want to go into how AI has reconfigured, how AI can reconfigure, medical labor, and then it can, it can lead to gender de-skilling. So, as it is clearly visible in the slide, AI carries the risk for female healthcare professionals who, often dominate fields like nursing or and accountability for AI decisions remains complex. So there is a risk of reskilling the woman workforce, reducing their task and their task from nursing or from any other task related to healthcare to data, to de-scaling them into data integrators, into ethicists or auditors in particular work. So, and then how we can actually come across, or how we can actually go about reforming these kind of conditions, and what could be the probable solutions that can be shaped, and policies that can be that we can come up is like, can we have to go beyond techno-optimism and assessing the impact of AI on society has to be done in a very critical manner. Participatory governance has to be enabled. There has to be sorts of collaborations where governments across the global south can come together in formulating of these policies. Rural and geographically disparate populations and populations within which women population has to be accounted for, where such policies are being framed or designed, and culturally contextualized designs and cultural norms, practices, the traditions and heritage has to be taken into account when such AI enhanced mechanisms are operational, or when it is designed particularly to suit or to meet the demands of healthcare, particularly for women. So these are some of the emerging trends that are going into healthcare, particularly when it comes to gender, and some of the studies that are persistent in the literature, that are persistently there in terms of global south. So in conclusion, what I would like to bring up is, in order to future the growth of AI in a well-oriented manner, whereby gender can be kept into discussion and biasness can be reduced. There has to be equity in place. There has to be a lot of discussions on equity. There has to be transparency when it comes to making decisions and of course making policies. And through the use of AI in transforming healthcare, these practices has to be strategically kept into place and develop localized gender-aware policies, and then fostering regional and international cooperations and collaborations with shared knowledge and practices has to be done, so that the ecosystem of the entire healthcare meets up with all the parameters, particularly and of course when it comes to concerning women and their healthcare. Thank you, sir.
Taman, it was a very well presented, and I feel you have covered the maximum part of the medications, especially the AI part, and it was a good. If in case anyone is having any kind of query or question, one or two people they can ask for this, and we can move to, otherwise we will move to the other presentation.
Thank you, sir.
I take no praise. Excellent paper. Now, next I'll call upon Anupama Pradhan for presenting the paper on transforming legal rules and cultural resistance. Right? So, Anupama Pradhan. Are you ready,
Thank you so
Anupama?
much, sir.
Yeah,
Thank
please.
you so much, sir. Very good afternoon. In fact, it's evening almost. Very good evening to respected chair of the session and organizing team and my fellow co-presenters. I am Anupama Pradhan, currently pursuing my PhD in the area of Eastern Himalayan literature and able supervision of my guide, Dr. Sanjukta Chatterjee. The title for my today's presentation is Transforming Gender Roles and Cultural Resistance, Revisiting Idealized Short Stories Through the Human Age. This paper explores the intersections of gender transformation and cultural resistance in some select translated short stories of Indubharu Rai. Indubharu Rai is a seminal figure of Indian Nepali literature who was born in Darjeeling, and his literary journey began in the post-independence era, a period marked by social transition and identity crisis among the Nepali diaspora in India. So his writing deeply engaged with questions of existence, identity, time, cultural resistance, and human consciousness. Gender roles, transformations, and cultural resistance refers to the interconnected process through which individuals, especially women, and marginalized groups or persons challenge and reshape the traditional norms that define gender identity and power relations within a given culture. Rai's character therefore involves questioning, revising, or breaking away from conventional roles, asserting agency and independence beyond domestic spaces. This paper intends to examine some select translated short stories, that's very good, which is translated as Long Night Song, Jayamaya Akumate Nithapani Adi, it as Jayamaya Alun हामी त्यस्तै महिनाकी आमा, which is again translated as Mayna's mother is just like that. Through the teenage within the theoretical framework of post-colonialism, post-text history, the gender and the and moving towards the location of culture. To explain the context, I would like to quickly go through the text which I have taken as a reason for the discussion. In Siliguri Mahila, that is Long Night Song, the protagonist, which is a female character, Salikiyama, emerges as one of the most remarkable characters who is naive and a simple woman of the village. Though she belongs to rustic world, she is an epitome of modern women who can analyze the purpose of life and has all the potentials to fight against the hardship and oddities of life. She equally contributes in ordering for her family where the conventional gender roles begin to collapse, giving equal space to a woman. Her strong characterization gives us a way to recognize gender roles transformation in evolving post-colonial society. Judith Butler, in her book Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, asserts gender is not something that one is, it is something one does, an act, or more precisely a sequence of acts, a word rather than a noun. She argues that gender is not a fixed identity, and we can see that through Kaliki Amma Adirai is somewhere transforming the gender roles with the cultural resistance. He also creates multi-dimensional characters shaped by psychological and emotional realism. His characterization of Jayamaya in the short story Jayamaya Akumate Nithapani Adi is the representation of existential and feminist consciousness. She is a teenage girl who is in exile along with her Nepali family and community. Jayamaya and her family have to leave their settlement in Burma, facing the consequences of Second World War. Despite her displacement, alienation and silence, Tribal Akintapani, which is within the frontier of Burma and India, near the state of Assam, practices herself as a survival but not as a victim. The portrait of her solitude frames her tragedy and becomes a statement of female resilience and existential strength. In this respect, I'd like to quote from Afad Raz, who says, "A diaspora space is the intersectionality of diaspora, a border and dislocation where belonging and unbelonging coexist." So, the arrival of Jeremiah at the border of Anikapani is something which is indicated towards the support country of our own identity and belongingness. To take my discussion further, I'd like to very quickly go through the two more speakers in text. One is Jad. The traditional practice of literary Kaiwa Injari, which is very common in Nepali community during 18th century, has been well portrayed in short Parichar by I.D. Rai. Literary Kaiwa is fitted kinship both considered in Nepali culture. Injari is a child of the narrative. The etiquette revolves around Tuli, who is the female protagonist who chooses love over the social obligations, apparently challenging the entrenched moral codes and exposes the contradictions within the traditional structures of marriage and honor. A rebellion that signifies the transformation of gender roles and the emergence of individual agency within a conservative society. And the last, to support my argument, I have taken a short story, Hamidusing Maina Ki Amma. Maina's mother is just like us, and is speaking in death. The story portrays the plight and perseverance of women in the Nepali society, and deeply tragedy Himalaya region. Maina Ki Amma emerges as representative figure of nomadic working class culture, struggling to sustain her livelihood by selling the vegetables in the local market. Through her daily hardship, this story reflects not only the economic marginalization of women, but also their silent resilience in a rapidly modernizing world. Idealized writing transcends mere storytelling, becoming sites of cultural allegations where tradition confronts modernity and marginalized voices, especially women and subaltern communities asserting their agency. So to conclude, moreover, its attention to gender dynamics, migration and identity formation underscores its relevance in contemporary critical discourses on post-colonialism and cultural resistance, providing a window to overview his work on several aspects. Thank you so much. Sir, your voice is not audible, sir. So you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Aruna. It was very well presented and using the short stories. And thanks a lot for remembering taking care of the time. Yes, we are getting short with the time, so you have taken care of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Next, I'll call upon Razi Bhargava with his name. Bhargava.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for introducing me. My name is Rafi Bhargav and I am currently doing my PhD from MIT University, Noida. Let me share the slides with you. I hope the screen is visible.
Not that.
Oh, okay, sir. Is it visible now?
Not yet.
I don't know what the problem is, but I'm not able to share my screen with you all. I'm sorry for that.
You start with the purpose of your
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. The title of my paper is From Wounds to Withdrawal, the Cycle of Trauma and Addiction Among African American Women. Now, in an age of globalization, a force that claims to break barriers and empower women, many have indeed entered new spaces, classrooms, boardrooms, and digital worlds. Yet beneath this progress lies a darker reality. For women of color, especially African American women, the promise of globalization often coexists with deep-rooted trauma, systematic exclusion, and silence. So, my paper, which explores Jasmine Ward's novel Siliguri Singh, examines how these wounds manifest as substance abuse. Globalization has been both liberating and limiting. It has unsettling hierarchies, yet also intensified global inequalities. In this shifting world, intersectionality, a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, becomes essential to understanding the overlapping pressures of race, gender, and class that shape women's experiences. African American women, historically positioned at this intersection, inherit not only economic marginalization but also intergenerational trauma, a psychological legacy of slavery, segregation, and systematic racism. This inherited pain often translates into substance abuse, not out of moral weakness but as a desperate coping mechanism, a way to survive a world that continually denies them healing and dignity. In Jasmine Ward's Siliguri Singh, the character Leonie embodies this struggle. She is a young mother, addicted to drugs, caught between love for her children and the scars of her past. Her addiction is not an isolated event, it reflects a collective historical injury. Ward's portrayal resonates beyond America, across the globe, as capitalism and media globalized ideas of womanhood. Marginalized women are still made invisible. The same global systems that celebrate empowerment continue to commodify female bodies and ignore those who do not fit its idealized image. Leonie's withdrawal from reality mirrors how marginalized women are pushed to the peripheries of global progress. In this sense, her addiction becomes symbolic of exclusion, the emotional cost of belonging nowhere. Moreover, the hyper-visibility of privileged women in media often contrasts sharply with the invisibility of women like Leonie. Globalization amplifies certain voices while silencing others, creating what feminist theorist Chandra Talpade Mohanty calls decolonization of women's narratives. Yet, Siliguri Singh also offers a counterpoint through spirituality and family. The character Mam, Philomene, who is Leonie's mother, represents ancestral memory, ritual, and faith. Her connection to spirituality provides strength and continuity, a link to communal healing that globalization often disrupts. Women grounded in spiritual and familial networks are, as my studies suggest, more resilient to addiction. Spirituality here becomes a form of cultural resistance, a reclaiming of identity and belonging that transcends Western materialism. It highlights that healing for women of color is not only medical but deeply cultural and spiritual, rooted in community and memory. Now, to conclude, From Wounds to Withdrawal argues that substance abuse among African American women must be seen not as individual failure but as a global symptom of systematic injustice. Globalization has opened many doors for women, but for those carrying the weight of historical trauma, those doors often lead to new forms of exclusion. Jasmine Ward's novel reminds us that progress without empathy only widens the gap between visibility and vulnerability. Healing, therefore, must move beyond personal recovery. It must become a collective, transnational act of remembrance and resistance. Only by acknowledging the invisible wounds created by both history and modern globalization can we truly move from withdrawal to liberation. That was all from my side. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ravi, very much. It was very good convincing. Things to withdraw. title of trauma and addiction among the African American women was well presented. If anyone is done
Thank you, sir.
So we'll move on to the next speaker. We have Rupasha Chakraborty. Rupasha.
Yes, sir. I am Ruksha Chakraborty. Yes.
Yeah, please. Carry on.
Is my screen visible? Because I see someone else is presenting maybe.
No, not now.